Hey guys, tonight we're not stepping into a peaceful palace or a courtly dance. We're diving headfirst into the shadows of power, where family dinners can end in murder, and your closest advisor might be sharpening a dagger behind that charming smile. This is the world of royal betrayal, where crowns are won and lost not on battlefields, but in bedchambers, throne rooms, and sometimes over a friendly cup of wine that tastes suspiciously bitter. Spoiler alert, trust was the most dangerous luxury any monarch could afford. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through the most ruthless royal betrayals in history. Picture this. You're sitting on a throne made of gold and centuries of accumulated paranoia. Everyone around you smiles, bows, and speaks in honeyed words. But behind those eyes lurks the constant question of whether today's the day they decide you've outlived your usefulness. Welcome to royal life, where your biggest enemies aren't foreign armies or peasant revolts. They're the people sharing your dinner table, sleeping in rooms down the hall, and calling you brother, sister, or beloved sovereign, while mentally measuring your neck for a noose. Let's start with one of history's most spectacular examples of family dysfunction taken to its logical, murderous conclusion. Meet Cleopatra VII. Yes, that Cleopatra, but not the romanticized version Hollywood sold you. This was a woman who understood that, in the royal game, sentiment was a luxury that could get you killed, and family loyalty was often just a pretty mask hiding a blade. When Cleopatra's father died, she was supposed to co-rule with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. The Ptolemaic tradition was charming that way, keeping power in the family through marriage between siblings. Nothing says stability like institutional incest with a side of political intrigue. But Ptolemy XIII, barely a teenager, had advisors who thought Egypt would be better off without his ambitious sister calling the shots. So, they did what royal advisors do best. They convinced the boy that his sister needed to disappear. The coup attempt was swift and efficient. Cleopatra found herself exiled from Alexandria, her own capital, forced to flee to Syria while her teenage brother played pharaoh under the watchful eye of his puppet masters. But here's where things get interesting. Cleopatra wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully and retire to a life of weaving tapestries. She raised an army, marched back to Egypt, and prepared to settle the family dispute the old-fashioned way, with violence. The civil war that followed was brutal, even by Ptolemaic standards, and that's saying something considering this was a dynasty that had turned fraternal murder into something of an art form. Brother fought sister across the Nile Delta, each convinced that Egypt was big enough for only one of them. The irony is delicious. In trying to eliminate Cleopatra through betrayal, Ptolemy XIII had created the exact scenario that would lead to his own destruction. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he found himself in the middle of this royal mess. History tells us that Cleopatra had herself smuggled to him in a carpet, though personally, I suspect she just walked through the front door with enough confidence to convince everyone she belonged there. Caesar, being Caesar, decided to back the woman who could string together a coherent sentence and had a better grasp of Egyptian politics than a teenage boy who was probably still figuring out which end of a sword to hold. The war's end was swift and decisive. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile, whether by accident, suicide, or helpful push from his sister's supporters, history doesn't say. What it does tell us is that Cleopatra showed no particular grief at her brother's demise. She had learned the fundamental lesson of royal survival. Betray or be betrayed. There's rarely a third option. But Cleopatra's education in family treachery wasn't over. After Ptolemy XIII's convenient death, she was expected to marry her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, and continue the co-ruling charade. This arrangement lasted exactly as long as it took Cleopatra to consolidate her power and realize that even a child ruler was a potential threat. Ptolemy XIV died mysteriously in 44 BCE. Around the same time, Cleopatra was securing her son Caesarion's position as her heir. Coincidence? In the world of royal betrayal, coincidences are about as rare as honest politicians. The beauty of Cleopatra's approach to family relations was its elegant simplicity. She didn't engage in elaborate conspiracies or Byzantine plotting. She identified threats to her power and eliminated them with the efficiency of a woman who understood that in the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. Her brothers had betrayed her first, thinking her exile would be permanent. Instead, it became their death sentence. But Egypt's royal backstabbing was merely the opening act in our tour of family dysfunction. Let's travel north and forward in time to medieval England, where royal betrayal was practically a national sport, and the phrase family values meant something entirely different from what we'd expect today. King John of England, forever remembered as the villain in Robin Hood stories, earned his place in history not through his failings as a monarch, though there were plenty of those, but through a betrayal so spectacular that it redefined the relationship between kings and their nobles for centuries to come. John didn't just break his word to his barons. He did it with such style and arrogance that he essentially forced them to invent constitutional monarchy just to keep him from destroying the kingdom entirely. The story begins with John's relationship with his barons, the powerful nobles who formed the backbone of medieval England's military and political system. These weren't modern politicians or bureaucrats. They were warrior aristocrats who held their lands in exchange for military service and loyalty to the crown. The arrangement worked well enough when kings understood that their power depended on maintaining the delicate balance between royal authority and noble privilege. John, however, suffered from what we might charitably call a chronic inability to read the room. He had a talent for making the worst possible decision in any given situation, combined with an arrogance that made him believe he could get away with anything because he wore a crown. It was a toxic combination that would make him one of history's most spectacularly unsuccessful kings. The betrayal that would define John's reign and change English history began with something seemingly mundane: money. John needed funds for his military campaigns in France, his attempts to win back the territories his brother Richard had lost, and his general policy of throwing English resources into a bottomless pit of continental European politics. The traditional way to raise money was to ask the barons for aid, which they would grant in exchange for the king's promise to respect their rights and follow established customs. John took their money, made the promises, and then promptly ignored every single commitment he'd made. He raised taxes without consultation, seized lands without legal justification, and generally behaved like a man who believed that being king meant never having to say, "You're sorry." When the barons protested, John's response was essentially, "What are you going to do about it?" It was a question he would soon regret asking. What they did about it was organize the most successful rebellion in English history. The barons didn't want to overthrow John. They wanted to force him to honor his agreements and govern according to law rather than royal whim. When John continued to ignore their demands, they took the radical step of renouncing their feudal oaths of loyalty and declaring war on their own king. The civil war that followed was brief but decisive. John's forces were outnumbered and outgeneraled by nobles who knew the country better than he did and commanded the loyalty of their own retainers. When London opened its gates to the rebel barons, John realized that his betrayal of the feudal contract had left him isolated and powerless. His own nobles had turned against him. His foreign mercenaries were expensive and unreliable, and his subjects viewed him as a tyrant rather than a legitimate king. Faced with complete defeat, John agreed to meet the barons at Runnymede in June 1215. What happened there would echo through centuries of English and later British history. The document they forced him to sign, Magna Carta, wasn't just a peace treaty, it was a fundamental redefinition of royal power. For the first time in English history, a king had been forced to acknowledge that his authority was limited by law and that he could be held accountable for his actions. The irony is exquisite. John's betrayal of his barons had forced them to create the legal framework that would eventually limit royal power forever. In trying to establish absolute monarchy through treachery, John had accidentally invented constitutional government. His personal faithlessness had created a system designed to prevent future kings from being as faithless as he was. But royal betrayal wasn't always about power struggles between kings and nobles. Sometimes it was far more intimate and infinitely more vicious. Let's journey to Renaissance Italy, where the Borgia family turned betrayal into high art and made murder a family business with Vatican approval. Cesare Borgia understood betrayal the way most people understand breathing, as a natural, necessary function of life. As the son of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare grew up in a world where family loyalty was absolute until it became inconvenient, and trust was a luxury that could get you killed. The Borgias didn't just betray their enemies, they betrayed their allies, their friends, and occasionally each other, all while maintaining the charming fiction that they were devout servants of God. Cesare's masterpiece of betrayal came during his campaign to unite central Italy under Borgia control. He had assembled a collection of condottieri, mercenary captains who commanded their own armies and were willing to work for whoever paid them best. These weren't modern soldiers following orders. They were essentially warlords with their own territories, ambitions, and agendas. Managing them required a delicate balance of bribery, intimidation, and strategic alliance-making. The problem with condottieri was that they were professionals in the business of war and politics. They understood treachery because they practiced it themselves. When several of Cesare's captains began to suspect that he was planning to eliminate them once their usefulness ended, they did what any reasonable person would do. They formed a conspiracy to eliminate him first. The plot was well conceived and might have succeeded against a less paranoid target. The conspirators planned to trap Cesare during what appeared to be a routine military conference, overwhelm his bodyguards, and divide his territories among themselves. It was the sort of practical, business-like approach to murder that made sense in Renaissance Italy, where political assassination was considered a legitimate career advancement strategy. But Cesare had been raised in the Borgia family, where suspicion was a survival skill, and paranoia was just good sense. He suspected the plot before it could be executed, and decided to turn the conspirators' own strategy against them. Instead of avoiding the meeting, he would attend it, but on his terms and with his own surprise prepared. The meeting took place at Senigallia on New Year's Eve, 1502, a date that would become synonymous with calculated betrayal in Italian political history. Cesare arrived with what appeared to be a small, vulnerable escort, playing the role of the trusting ally walking into an obvious trap. The conspirators relaxed, convinced that their enemy had delivered himself into their hands. What they didn't know was that Cesare had positioned his real forces around the town, hidden but ready to strike on his signal. When the conspirators revealed their hand and moved to arrest him, they found themselves surrounded by soldiers loyal to the man they thought they were betraying. The hunters had become the hunted in a matter of moments. What followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Cesare didn't simply execute the conspirators. He played with them first. He accepted their surrender, granted them pardons, and treated them as honored guests while his soldiers secured the town. For hours, the conspirators believed they had somehow escaped the consequences of their treachery. They dined with Cesare, toasted the new year, and probably began planning their next moves. Then, in the early hours of 1503, Cesare's soldiers came for them. Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo were strangled in their beds. Paolo Orsini and Francesco Orsini met similar fates. The betrayers had been betrayed by a master of the craft, and their deaths sent a clear message to anyone else considering similar plots. Cesare Borgia was not a man to be trifled with. The beauty of Cesare's betrayal lay not just in its execution, but in its psychological impact. He had turned his enemies' own plot against them, using their expectations and assumptions to lure them into a trap. More importantly, he had demonstrated that in the world of Renaissance politics, trust was not just dangerous, but potentially fatal. After Senigallia, other condottieri thought twice before plotting against the Borgias. But even Cesare's masterstroke pales in comparison to one of history's most shocking royal betrayals. A case where family bonds meant absolutely nothing when weighed against political ambition and personal survival. Let's travel to Scotland in the late 15th century, where James III would learn that being king meant very little when your own family decided you needed to be replaced. James III of Scotland was not a particularly bad king by medieval standards, which is to say he was probably incompetent, definitely unpopular, and certainly unaware that his reign was about to end in a way that would make family dinners awkward for generations. His crime wasn't tyranny or military failure. It was the far more subtle but equally dangerous offense of disappointing his nobles and alienating his brothers. The betrayal began with what seemed like a minor family dispute over the distribution of royal favor and land grants. James had a tendency to rely on low-born advisors rather than the traditional noble counselors, a practice that annoyed his aristocrats and infuriated his siblings. His brothers, Alexander Stuart, Duke of Albany, and John Stuart, Earl of Mar, believed they deserved more prominent roles in government and were increasingly frustrated with their older brother's policies. Family tensions escalated when James began to suspect that his brothers were plotting against him. In medieval Scotland, royal paranoia was usually justified, and James's suspicions were probably well-founded. What he didn't anticipate was how far his brothers were willing to go to remove him from power. The crisis came to a head when James arrested both of his brothers on charges of treason. It was a reasonable precaution by medieval standards, but it proved to be a fatal miscalculation. John Stuart died in custody under mysterious circumstances, probably murdered on James's orders. Alexander escaped from Edinburgh Castle in a feat that would have impressed any adventure novelist. He killed his guards, lowered himself down the castle walls on a rope, and fled to France to gather support for his return. James probably thought he had solved his family problem by eliminating one brother and exiling the other. Instead, he had created a deadly enemy with a legitimate claim to the throne and nothing left to lose. Alexander Stuart was no longer just a disgruntled sibling. He was a pretender with royal blood, foreign backing, and a very personal grudge against the man who had murdered his brother. Alexander's revenge was swift and brutal. He returned to Scotland with English support and an army of Scottish exiles who had their own grievances against James III. The king found himself facing not just a military invasion, but a full-scale rebellion supported by many of his own nobles who had decided that Alexander might make a better ruler than his brother. The civil war that followed was brief but decisive. James III's support melted away as nobles defected to his brother's cause or simply withdrew from the conflict entirely. When the two armies met at Sauchiburn in 1488, James's forces were outnumbered and outfought by men who believed they were fighting for a legitimate cause rather than a failing king. James III died during or immediately after the battle, though the exact circumstances remain mysterious. Some accounts say he was killed in the fighting, others suggest he was murdered while trying to flee. What's certain is that his death ended one of Scotland's most spectacular cases of fraternal betrayal. Alexander had achieved his revenge, but the victory was hollow. He never became king himself, and the throne passed to James's young son, the future James IV. The tragedy of James III's downfall was that it began with reasonable concerns and escalated through mutual distrust into family annihilation. If James had handled his brother's grievances differently, or if his brothers had been content with lesser roles, the betrayal might never have happened. Instead, family loyalty collapsed under the weight of ambition and suspicion, leading to a civil war that weakened Scotland for years to come. But royal betrayal wasn't always about dramatic battles or public executions. Sometimes the most effective treachery happened quietly, in private chambers where whispered words could be deadlier than drawn swords. Let's examine one of history's most subtle and devastating betrayals, the case of Emperor Justinian and his general Belisarius, where loyalty and suspicion danced a deadly waltz that nearly destroyed the Byzantine Empire's greatest military commander. Belisarius was the kind of general that emperors dream of having and then spend sleepless nights worrying about. He was brilliant, successful, charismatic, and absolutely loyal to Justinian, which made him incredibly valuable and potentially terrifying. In the Byzantine Empire, where military coups were as common as sunrise, a popular general was always just one bad decision away from becoming an existential threat to the throne. The relationship between Justinian and Belisarius began as the perfect partnership between emperor and general. Justinian provided resources, strategic direction, and political support, while Belisarius delivered victory after victory on the battlefield. He crushed the Vandals in North Africa, conquered much of Italy from the Ostrogoths, and defended Constantinople from barbarian invasions. He was, quite simply, the most successful Roman general since Julius Caesar. But success breeds suspicion in imperial courts, and Belisarius's victories made him increasingly dangerous in Justinian's eyes. The emperor began to worry that his general's popularity with the army might tempt him to march on Constantinople and claim the purple for himself. It was a reasonable fear. Many Byzantine emperors had seized power exactly that way, and Belisarius certainly had the military capability to attempt it. The betrayal began not with dramatic accusations or public trials, but with subtle undermining that was far more devastating than outright hostility. Justinian started recalling Belisarius from campaigns just as they were reaching critical phases, claiming that other emergencies required his attention. He reduced the general's resources, assigned him insufficient troops for his missions, and began promoting rival commanders who could serve as counterweights to Belisarius's influence. Each of these decisions seemed reasonable in isolation. Emperors needed to balance competing priorities, manage limited resources, and prevent any single individual from becoming too powerful. But taken together, they represented a systematic campaign to weaken Belisarius without providing him with grounds for open rebellion. Justinian was destroying his most valuable military asset, while maintaining the fiction that he was simply managing the empire's affairs. The psychological torture of this approach was exquisite. Belisarius remained personally loyal to Justinian, refusing to believe that his emperor was deliberately sabotaging him. He attributed his difficulties to imperial priorities he didn't understand, communication problems, or the natural challenges of governing a vast empire. His loyalty prevented him from recognizing the betrayal that was slowly destroying his career and reputation. The campaign reached its climax when Justinian recalled Belisarius from Italy, just as he was on the verge of completing the reconquest of the Western Empire. The general had spent years fighting the Ostrogoths, gradually wearing down their resistance and capturing their major strongholds. Victory was within reach when the emperor decided that he needed Belisarius elsewhere, leaving the Italian campaign incomplete and vulnerable to counterattack. Belisarius obeyed the recall order, demonstrating the loyalty that made him both invaluable and dangerous. But his departure from Italy allowed the Ostrogoths to recover and launch a counteroffensive that recaptured much of the territory he had won. Years of fighting and thousands of deaths had been wasted because Justinian couldn't bring himself to trust the one man capable of achieving his military objectives. The ultimate irony of Justinian's betrayal was that it was entirely unnecessary. Belisarius never showed any inclination toward rebellion or disloyalty. He served faithfully until his death, accepting recall orders, reduced resources, and imperial suspicion without complaint. Had Justinian trusted his general and provided him with adequate support, the Byzantine Empire might have successfully reconquered the entire Western Mediterranean. Instead, the emperor's paranoia ensured that his reign's greatest military opportunities were squandered. The betrayal of Belisarius didn't just harm one man, it weakened the empire and contributed to the eventual loss of Italy to the Lombards. Trust, it turned out, was not just a moral issue but a strategic necessity that Justinian never learned to value. Our journey through royal betrayal now takes us to perhaps its most chilling manifestation, the case where betrayal wore the mask of religious duty and family affection. In 16th century England, the relationship between Henry VIII and Thomas More demonstrated how even the closest friendships could be sacrificed on the altar of political necessity. Thomas More was Henry VIII's friend, advisor, and eventually his victim in one of history's most personal royal betrayals. Their relationship began with genuine mutual respect and affection. More was brilliant, witty, and shared Henry's love of learning and intellectual discourse. The king valued More's counsel, enjoyed his company, and trusted him with the highest offices in the realm, ultimately appointing him Lord Chancellor of England. But friendship between a king and a subject is always conditional, and the conditions of More's friendship with Henry became impossible to meet when the king decided to break with Rome and establish himself as head of the Church of England. More, a devout Catholic and respected theologian, could not in good conscience support Henry's claim to spiritual authority. His refusal to take the oath recognizing Henry's supremacy created an impossible situation for both men. The betrayal was particularly cruel because both men understood what was happening and were powerless to stop it. Henry needed More's support to legitimize his religious revolution. More's endorsement would signal to other intellectuals and churchmen that the break with Rome was theologically sound. But More's conscience wouldn't allow him to support what he believed was heresy, regardless of his personal loyalty to the king. Henry's response demonstrated the ruthless pragmatism that characterized his reign. He couldn't afford to let More's opposition stand unchallenged, because it undermined the entire foundation of his new religious settlement. If a man of More's stature and integrity could reject the king's spiritual authority, others might follow his example. The friendship that had enriched both men's lives became a political liability that had to be eliminated. The process by which Henry destroyed More was masterfully calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining the fiction of legal propriety, rather than simply ordering More's execution, which would have made him an obvious martyr. Henry subjected him to a series of increasingly harsh measures designed to break his resolve and force him to submit. More was stripped of his offices, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and subjected to repeated interrogations designed to trap him into explicit statements of defiance that could justify his execution. His family was pressured to intercede with him, his property was confiscated, and his friends were warned to distance themselves from his cause. Every aspect of his life was systematically destroyed in an attempt to make submission preferable to continued resistance. The psychological warfare was particularly sophisticated because Henry knew More's character intimately. The king understood that More valued his family's welfare, feared poverty, and deserved intellectual respect. By threatening all of these simultaneously, Henry created a situation where surrender seemed rational and continued resistance appeared to be selfish stubbornness. But More's integrity proved stronger than Henry's manipulation. Despite the pressure, the former Lord Chancellor refused to take the oath or explicitly endorse the king's spiritual supremacy. His silence on the matter was legally insufficient. Henry needed active support, not mere absence of opposition. When it became clear that More would never provide what the king required, his death became inevitable. The execution of Thomas More in 1535 marked the completion of one of history's most personal royal betrayals. Henry had destroyed a genuine friend, a man who had served him faithfully for years, and whose only crime was an inability to violate his own conscience. The king had chosen political necessity over personal loyalty, demonstrating that in the world of absolute monarchy, even friendship was expendable when it conflicted with royal will. The irony of More's martyrdom was that it probably strengthened rather than weakened opposition to Henry's religious policies. By killing such an obviously virtuous man for such obviously principled reasons, Henry created a symbol of resistance that would inspire Catholic opposition for generations. The betrayal that was supposed to consolidate the king's spiritual authority instead demonstrated its moral bankruptcy. As we've seen throughout our journey, royal betrayal often created the very problems it was designed to solve. Cleopatra's brother's treachery led to their destruction. King John's faithlessness created constitutional monarchy. Cesare Borgia's enemies' conspiracy resulted in their own elimination. James III's suspicion of his brothers precipitated the civil war that killed him. Justinian's distrust of Belisarius weakened the empire, and Henry's betrayal of More created a martyr who challenged royal supremacy more effectively in death than he ever could have in life. But perhaps the most spectacular example of betrayal's unintended consequences comes from the story of Ivan the Terrible and his son, where paranoia and violence consumed not just enemies and friends, but the royal family itself. Ivan IV of Russia earned his epithet through a reign of terror that made previous examples of royal brutality seem mild by comparison. But his ultimate betrayal was the murder of his own heir in a moment of rage that destroyed his dynasty's future. Ivan's relationship with his son, Ivan Ivanovich, was complicated by the impossible pressures of Russian royal succession and the elder Ivan's deteriorating mental state. The Tsar had spent decades eliminating potential rivals, real and imagined, in a campaign of violence that had traumatized Russian society and isolated him from everyone who might have provided counsel or restraint. By the 1580s, Ivan the Terrible was a man who trusted no one and saw enemies everywhere, including within his own family. The crisis between father and son developed over Russian foreign policy and military strategy. Ivan Ivanovich, serving as heir and military commander, disagreed with his father's approach to the ongoing Livonian War, a conflict that had drained Russian resources and achieved little strategic gain. The younger Ivan advocated for a more aggressive military stance and criticized what he saw as his father's increasingly erratic decision-making. For most fathers and sons, such disagreements might lead to heated arguments or temporary estrangement. For Ivan the Terrible, disagreement was tantamount to treason, and treason demanded violent response. The Tsar's paranoia had reached the point where he interpreted any criticism, even from his own heir, as evidence of conspiracy against his authority. The betrayal reached its climax during a confrontation in November 1581, when father and son argued over military policy and the younger Ivan's pregnant wife's clothing, which the elder Ivan deemed inappropriate. The argument escalated beyond mere disagreement into a physical altercation that would have consequences no one could have anticipated. In his rage, Ivan the Terrible struck his son with his iron-pointed staff, inflicting a head wound that proved fatal. The Tsarevich died several days later, leaving his father to confront the magnitude of his betrayal. In a moment of uncontrolled anger, Ivan had destroyed his dynasty's future and eliminated the one person who might have provided competent leadership for Russia's future. The psychological aftermath of the murder consumed Ivan's remaining years. Contemporary accounts describe him as being overwhelmed by grief and guilt, spending his time in prayer and self-recrimination that came too late to undo the damage. He had betrayed not just his son, but his country's future, leaving Russia with a succession crisis that would plague the realm for decades. Ivan's younger son, Fyodor, was mentally incapacitated and childless, meaning that the murder of Ivan Ivanovich had effectively ended the Rurik dynasty that had ruled Russia for 7 centuries. The time of troubles that followed Ivan's death in 1584 saw foreign invasion, civil war, and political chaos that nearly destroyed the Russian state. The ultimate betrayal had been not just personal, but civilizational. The story of Ivan and his son represents royal betrayal at its most destructive, where paranoia and violence had become so habitual that they consumed everything, including the future itself. Unlike other cases we've examined, where betrayal served some rational political purpose, Ivan's murder of his heir achieved nothing except the satisfaction of momentary rage and the destruction of everything he had worked to build. The psychological mechanics of royal betrayal reveal fascinating patterns that transcend individual personalities or historical periods. Consider how each of our examples demonstrates a similar progression: initial trust or cooperation, growing suspicion or competition, escalating tension, decisive betrayal, and finally, consequences that nobody fully anticipated. This pattern suggests that royal betrayal wasn't just a series of random, violent acts, but a predictable outcome of systems that concentrated unlimited power in fallible human beings. What makes these betrayals particularly chilling is how they often began with the best of intentions. Cleopatra's brothers genuinely believed Egypt would be better served with a male ruler. King John probably convinced himself that royal prerogatives were necessary for effective governance. Justinian's suspicion of Belisarius arose from legitimate concerns about military coups. Henry VIII likely believed that religious unity required Thomas More's submission. The road to royal betrayal was paved not just with good intentions, but with rational justifications that made perfect sense to the people implementing them. This rationalization process reveals one of the most disturbing aspects of royal betrayal: its ability to transform moral people into monsters through incremental steps that each seemed reasonable in isolation. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to murder their brother or execute their best friend. Instead, they make a series of small compromises, each justified by circumstances, until they find themselves capable of actions that would have horrified their younger selves. The bureaucratization of betrayal was particularly evident in cases like Henry VIII's destruction of Thomas More. The king didn't simply order More's execution in a fit of rage. Instead, he created an elaborate, legal, and administrative process designed to make the betrayal appear justified and inevitable. Laws were passed, procedures were followed, documents were signed, and officials carried out their duties with the same mundane efficiency they might apply to tax collection or road maintenance. The machinery of government transformed personal betrayal into state policy, making everyone complicit and no one directly responsible. This institutionalization of treachery had profound psychological effects on both perpetrators and victims. Henry VIII could convince himself that he was merely enforcing the law rather than murdering a friend. More could maintain his dignity by treating his persecution as a legal rather than personal matter. And the officials implementing the betrayal could sleep at night knowing they were just following orders. The system diffused responsibility and moral clarity in ways that made betrayal both easier to commit and harder to resist. The cultural context surrounding royal betrayal also reveals important patterns. In societies where royal authority was considered divine or semi-divine, betraying a monarch wasn't just treason, it was sacrilege. This religious dimension added layers of complexity to royal betrayal that modern audiences often miss. When Cleopatra eliminated her brothers, she wasn't just removing political rivals. She was asserting her divine right to rule Egypt as a goddess queen. When Ivan the Terrible murdered his son, he wasn't just destroying his heir, he was violating sacred obligations that connected him to God and his ancestors. The religious justifications for royal betrayal were particularly sophisticated in Christian Europe, where rulers had to reconcile their actions with explicit biblical commandments against murder and betrayal. The solution was usually to create theological frameworks that transformed political necessity into divine will. Henry VIII's break with Rome wasn't presented as royal convenience, but as God's plan for England. Ivan the Terrible's violence wasn't described as personal weakness, but as divine instrument of justice. These justifications weren't just propaganda. They were genuine attempts by religious monarchs to reconcile their actions with their beliefs. The international dimensions of royal betrayal created additional complications that often escalated local conflicts into regional catastrophes. When Alexander Stuart fled Scotland to gather foreign support against his brother James III, he wasn't just seeking military assistance. He was inviting foreign intervention in Scottish domestic affairs. The resulting civil war weakened Scotland for generations and made it more vulnerable to English influence. Similarly, Justinian's betrayal of Belisarius didn't just harm one general. It compromised Byzantine military effectiveness and contributed to the empire's eventual loss of Italy to foreign invaders. These international consequences reveal how royal betrayal could create cascading effects that harmed entire civilizations. The rulers who practiced betrayal were often thinking in terms of immediate political advantage, but their actions had strategic implications that lasted for centuries. The weakening of central authority through royal betrayal often created power vacuums that foreign enemies were happy to exploit, turning domestic political problems into existential threats to national survival. The economic costs of royal betrayal were equally devastating and often underestimated by the perpetrators. Civil wars consumed resources that could have been used for infrastructure, education, or economic development. The uncertainty created by royal betrayal discouraged trade, investment, and long-term planning. Merchants and craftsmen couldn't plan for the future when they didn't know which faction would control the government next month. The result was economic stagnation that could persist for decades after the immediate political crisis had been resolved. King John's betrayal of his barons, for example, didn't just create constitutional monarchy. It also bankrupted the English crown and disrupted trade relationships that had taken generations to build. The resources that John spent on foreign mercenaries and civil war could have been used to develop England's economy or improve its military infrastructure. Instead, his treachery created a cycle of conflict and debt that hampered English development for years. The psychological trauma inflicted by royal betrayal extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect entire societies. when subjects could no longer trust their rulers to honor basic agreements or respect traditional rights. The social contract that held civilization together began to deteriorate. People stopped investing in long-term projects, became more suspicious of authority, and developed survival strategies that prioritized self-preservation over civic duty. This social trauma was particularly evident in Ivan the Terrible's Russia, where decades of royal violence had created a culture of fear and suspicion that persisted long after Ivan's death. Russian nobles learned to survive by avoiding any action that might be interpreted as threatening to royal authority. They stopped speaking honestly to rulers, avoided taking initiative, and focused on protecting themselves rather than serving the state. The result was a weakened, paranoid political system that struggled to respond effectively to external threats or internal challenges. The gender dynamics of royal betrayal add another layer of complexity to our understanding of these historical events. Female rulers like Cleopatra faced different expectations and constraints than their male counterparts, which influenced both the forms their betrayals took and the ways they were remembered by history. Cleopatra's elimination of her brothers was characterized by later historians as particularly ruthless, perhaps because it violated contemporary expectations about feminine behavior. But female rulers also had to navigate betrayal differently because they couldn't rely on traditional masculine displays of power. They had to be more subtle, more psychologically sophisticated, and more politically clever than male rulers who could simply execute enemies and expect to be obeyed. This required different skills and created different vulnerabilities, making female royal betrayal both more complex and potentially more effective than its masculine counterparts. The technological constraints of different historical periods also shaped the forms that royal betrayal could take. In ancient Egypt, Cleopatra's betrayals had to be carried out through face-to-face interactions and physical proximity. There were no telegraphs, telephones, or mass media to coordinate complex conspiracies or disseminate propaganda. This meant that royal betrayal was necessarily intimate and personal, requiring direct relationships between betrayers and victims. Medieval and Renaissance betrayals occurred in slightly more technologically sophisticated environments, where written communication, banking systems, and nascent diplomatic networks allowed for more complex and far-reaching conspiracies. Cesare Borgia could coordinate his betrayal of the condottieri across multiple cities and involve numerous accomplices because the infrastructure existed to support such complexity. The evolution of royal betrayal techniques over time reveals how rulers learned from their predecessors' successes and failures. Later, betrayers developed more sophisticated methods for avoiding the negative consequences that had destroyed earlier practitioners. They became better at managing public opinion, controlling information, and creating legal justifications for their actions. Henry VIII's betrayal of Thomas More was far more sophisticated than, say, a medieval king's simple assassination of a rival. Henry created an entire legal and administrative framework designed to make More's execution appear justified and inevitable. He managed the process carefully to minimize public sympathy for More while maximizing the deterrent effect on other potential opponents. This sophistication made Henry's betrayal more effective in the short term, but also more psychologically damaging to English society in the long term. The literary and artistic representations of royal betrayal have profoundly influenced how we understand these historical events. Shakespeare's portrayal of royal treachery, Machiavelli's analysis of political necessity, and countless other artistic works have created narrative frameworks that shape our interpretation of historical evidence. Sometimes these representations illuminate important truths about power and human nature. Other times, they distort our understanding by imposing modern sensibilities on historical actors who operated according to very different moral and practical considerations. The romanticization of certain royal betrayers in popular culture reveals interesting patterns in how societies choose to remember their past. Figures like Cesare Borgia have been transformed from brutal power brokers into romantic anti-heroes, while others like Ivan the Terrible remain symbols of tyrannical excess. These cultural choices reflect not just historical evidence, but contemporary values and anxieties about power, violence, and moral compromise. As our journey through royal betrayal draws to a close, we can see certain patterns emerging from these tales of treachery and violence. Royal betrayal was rarely motivated by simple malice or personal vindictiveness. More often, it resulted from the structural pressures of absolute power, where trust became a luxury that rulers couldn't afford, and loyalty was always conditional on political utility. The irony running through all these stories is that betrayal, intended to solve problems or eliminate threats, usually created worse difficulties than the original issues it was meant to address. Cleopatra's brother's treachery turned her into a more formidable enemy. King John's faithlessness created constitutional limits on royal power. Cesare Borgia's enemies' conspiracy led to their own destruction. James III's suspicion precipitated the very rebellion he feared. Justinian's distrust of Belisarius weakened the empire. Henry VIII's betrayal of Thomas More created a powerful symbol of resistance, and Ivan the Terrible's murder of his son destroyed his dynasty. Perhaps the most sobering lesson from these tales is that royal betrayal was not an aberration in the exercise of absolute power, but its logical consequence. When individuals held life and death authority over their subjects, when succession was determined by birth rather than merit, and when no legal or institutional restraints existed to check royal will, betrayal became an inevitable tool of statecraft. The modern world's development of constitutional government, legal protections for individual rights, and institutional checks on executive power represents, in many ways, a systematic attempt to make royal betrayal impossible. We have learned from these historical examples that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that trust between rulers and ruled requires legal foundations that no individual, regardless of their title or authority, can violate with impunity. Yet, even in our supposedly more civilized age, the temptations that led to royal betrayal, the desire for power, the fear of rivals, the willingness to sacrifice principle for expediency remain constant features of human nature. The stories we've explored tonight serve not just as entertainment, but as warnings about what happens when these temptations are given free rein. The most ruthless royal betrayals in history remind us that power without accountability, trust without verification, and loyalty without reciprocity create systems that inevitably consume themselves. The crowns and thrones have changed, but the fundamental dynamics of power and betrayal remain as relevant today as they were in the palaces of ancient Egypt, medieval England, Renaissance Italy, or Muscovite Russia. Perhaps that's the real lesson from these tales of royal treachery. Not that absolute power corrupts absolutely, though it certainly does, but that betrayal, once unleashed, becomes a self-perpetuating cycle that destroys everything it touches. The rulers who thought they could control betrayal by practicing it themselves invariably discovered that they had unleashed forces they could neither direct nor contain. In the end, the most ruthless royal betrayals in history were not just acts of individual cruelty or political calculation. They were symptoms of systems that made trust impossible, loyalty conditional, and violence inevitable. They remind us that the price of power, when unchecked by law or conscience, is not just the destruction of enemies but the corruption of everything that makes civilization worth preserving. And so, as we return from our journey through these dark chapters of human history, we can perhaps appreciate more fully the fragile institutions and hard-won principles that prevent modern leaders from walking the blood-soaked paths that their royal predecessors trod with such devastating consequences. The betrayals we've witnessed tonight serve as monuments to the destructive potential of unchecked power, and the enduring importance of systems that make such betrayals not just illegal, but impossible. The royal betrayers of history thought they were securing their power through treachery. Instead, they created legacies of mistrust, violence, and instability that outlasted their reigns, and in many cases their dynasties. They remind us that in the game of power, the most ruthless players often become their own most devastating victims, and that the price of absolute authority is often the destruction of everything that authority was meant to protect.